They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty, and we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 92 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris and I'm your host. As libertarians, we are always wanting to educate people on economics. It's something that's frustrating to be in a world where the media and just about any discussion about economics kind of has so many fallacies and misunderstandings and poorly defined terms, and it's maddening. And so we're always recommending books to people. Once in a while, people read one of those books and has a lot of those myths dispelled. One sort of impediment to that is people sometimes don't like to read books, and the people who do like to read books, they don't necessarily like to read one that it's very long, and no one likes to get like an assignment from a friend or something like that. But my guest today has, I think, really filled a gap in the market that even better than like Economics in One Lesson. I know there's a book by Peter Schiff that a lot of people recommend that I have not read, but Per Bylund has just published a book called How to Think About the Economy, a primer, and it was published by the Mises Institute just a few weeks ago, so you know it's good, and it's very short. I read it, I think, in just an afternoon, like an hour or so, over 2 or 3 days. And it's great. It gets at all the basics. It does it in a very concise way. And this is something that you're going to want to read yourself just as a refresher on things, but it's something that you'll be able to pass out to people, and they won't feel like they're getting an assignment that's going to take them weeks to complete. Per is a associate professor of entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. He's also, of course, a research fellow, postdoctoral research fellow in economics and entrepreneurship at the Mises Institute, has been for the last decade or so. He's also published The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized, which is a book about how regulations affect our everyday lives, a few years ago. And also, I don't know if it's out yet or it's about to come out. We talk about it in this episode, but he edited a volume called A Modern Guide to Austrian Economics, which from his description is on the opposite side of things. So that's for a scholar who really wants to get into the weeds. And I know if Per Bylund had a hand in it, it would be worth it if you are interested in those topics. But I think the book we're going to talk about today, How to Think About the Economy, is something that literally any adult who wants to know how the world works should read. We'll have links to all of the books I just mentioned and a couple of the things that we talk about in the interview at decentralizedrevolution.com/92. And I think you're going to enjoy our talk. It's a pleasure to meet you, Per. I just heard your episode of Ask an Austrian several days ago, and it was really great. And I just finished your book today, How to Think About the Economy. And I can say that I think that if someone were asking me about, hey, what is economics? How should we think about economics? My wife sometimes who's not a libertarian is like, how come you guys have a different view of economics than everyone else? This is the book I would recommend. A lot of people recommend Economics in One Lesson. I personally would recommend this one. And then if they like this one, I would go up to Choice by Bob Murphy and then graduate to, Rothbard and Mises. So I just want to thank you for writing the book. It's going to be a great resource for me. And I think a lot of other people here in the Mises caucus and libertarians who want to educate people about things. So congratulations on what you've done here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And that was actually the reason I wrote it too, just to have sort of this introduction that is an overview that is understandable by lay people, non-economists can read it and they can get sort of insight into how to think about the economy. And it is really easy, but a whole lot of people go wrong with it.
Yeah, and I like the fact that it's short too, because people, especially with a topic like economics, like people think it's going to be boring and dry, maybe from their experiences in college. I know I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of my questions. So you have to break things down for people, and I think that's one of the advantages of the Austrian approach that I think helps us, market the ideas, to use a term that, free market, we're trying to free market of ideas, is that economics isn't really numbers and charts and financial predictions and things like that, which is what people think. Like one time my wife said, oh, my husband, she kind of made a joke about he reads economics for fun. And this person who she said this to was like, oh, well, what should I invest in? And, that kind of misses out on a lot of other things. And one of the things that you point out fairly early is that I'll just read the sentence. Economics is a framework for how to think and reason about the economy, for making sense of what is going on, and intuition, if you will. I really, really like that, those two sentences.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I get that question a lot myself when I say that I'm an economist. People always think about the stock market, and they think about. I think the problem is that when we talk about the market in general, we think of Wall Street. So we think of stock markets, and we think of maybe options and investments like that. But we don't really think about the economy around us. But at the same time, we accept that, well, the economy has something to do with unemployment. It has something to do with standard of living. It has something to do with price inflation and things like that too. So it's one of those words that it's so easy. We'll spend our lives in the economy, contributing to it and living off of it. I mean, both. Yet at the same time, we don't have no clue what it is.
Yep.
And I think even most economists can't really define what is an economy.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let's lay a little bit of a framework first. Like, how did you end up being where you are today? So tell us, what you do as an economist, where you do it, and how you got to that, and what attracted you to the field.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I'm a professor of entrepreneurship, and in entrepreneurship, Austrian economics is a really big influence, and many of the sort of core concepts and the theories are really borrowed from Austrian economics. The whole framework is not, for sure, but the way to look at entrepreneurship and how it deals with things and what it means in the economy, it's pretty much Austrian. I mean, maybe not 100%, but most of it is. So in that sense, I feel at home in entrepreneurship for sure. I mean, and how did I end up here? Well, it's unfortunately, Austrian economics used to be one of the main streams in economics, and today it's completely, it's not part of anything at all. You can't study it really. You can't teach it. You can't do research in it or anything like that if you want a career in academia. So if you're an Austrian, they will basically treat you as a Marxist, but a little more fringe, perhaps, because people are actually Marxists and people have heard of them, but Austrians, they're just weirdos. And of course, ideologues and all this other stuff. Right. So in economics, there's simply no space for Austrians. And there's also, which is really a shame, in economics, there's no space for economic reasoning and there's no space for sort of verbal reasoning as we do in Austrian economics. It's all about math or data mining, pretty much.
Talk about the difference between those two approaches and why you think the latter approach is and has been dominant for the last, I guess, basically since after World War II, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, economics used to be like most disciplines. I mean, when you take courses in sociology or courses in any other social science, really, there are different schools of thought. So if you take a sociology course, you will learn a little bit about Marxist sociology and feminist sociology and so forth. And they have their own theories and they have their own literature, they have their own journals and everything like that. I mean, when you study economics, people don't really realize, but they're not different schools. You study micro and macro, and they claim to study different parts of the economy, different levels. But there are no different schools of thought. But that used to be the case. It used to be the case that there were several different schools of thought that sort of learned from each other and competed with each other and tried to figure out the best solutions to different problems. And Austrian economics was one of the big ones, at least after its founding in 1871. I think the problem now is that, well, there are two things really. Since economists have this very powerful tool, thinking about the economy in a very structured way in terms of trade-offs and things like that, economics was early in the social sciences, and it was also very powerful for uncovering what is actually going on. So economics has been called the queen of the social sciences for a very long time for that reason, because it can uncover a lot of the processes to help us understand society. Whereas other social sciences are not nearly as clear and not nearly as helpful. So economists are sort of the people that people turn to when they want to ask and have important questions answered, like in policy and stuff like that. So economists are used for that reason and for that purpose. But in order to be taken very seriously, they sort of turned towards, well, becoming a social science version of physics. Because in physics, you can predict and you can run experiments and you can be very exact in everything you say, right? And if you can do that, you are really scientific, which means you get to advise policymakers and decision makers. Whatever you say, there's no wiggle room really, because it's science, right? Social science has always been sort of the secondary to the natural sciences. If it's a hard science, then it's reliable in a different sense. So economists turn towards using mathematics and basically dressing up their theories in mathematics from the beginning, and then using math to derive truths and things like that, so that they could be more scientific. And I think it's Harry S. Truman, the president. I think he said once that he wanted a one-armed or one-handed economist. And the reason was that whenever you ask an economist, they would say, well, on the one hand and on the other hand, right? Because the trade-off in economics itself is a value-free science. You can't really tell anyone what is better, but you can tell, well, if you do this, then this will happen. But if you don't do that, then this other thing will happen. We can't say exactly how or exactly to what extent, but we can tell the difference, right? So, and that was the case until after the war. Because during the world wars, in a war economy, the whole economy is sort of taken over by the state, and everything is pushed towards minimizing all production except for the war machine.
Yep.
So you want to create tanks and fighter jets and what have you, all of those things, right? And with as little people as possible involved, because you want to send them overseas to die. And after this sort of war economy and all these economists sitting and making these calculations, you had the G.I. Joe bill with people coming back from the war, a lot of people getting education, college education, and you needed to rebuild and reopen the universities pretty much. And who do you hire to be the new scholars to teach people? Well, I mean, you hire the people who are already more or less in bed with government and who have already shown that they can know their stuff and whatever else, right? So they were hired, the people who were working in the war economy, and doing all this central planning. Whereas someone like Mises or some Austrians were, in a sense, more philosophers of society than they are physicists. They weren't very helpful, of course, during the central planning of the war machine, and therefore they were pretty much excluded. So I mean that's the reason economics is what it is that economists were pushing in that direction, and then the war sort of weeded out whoever was not on board with math and central planning.
Right, and I think the fact that the Keynesians, when did Keynes' big book come out? Wasn't it like early 20s? I think
1936 was his breakthrough.
So like right at the time of the New Deal, leading into, of course you had fascism in Europe, you had Marxism in the Soviet Union, and then you had the war economy thing, and sort of Keynesianism's basic assumptions really lend themselves to what governments kind of want to do anyway. So I think that the governments kind of used, we have a well-regarded social science who will confirm everything we want to do. So we're going to hire them, put them in charge of telling people about the economy during the war. And then once you have that sort of framework established, then it transitioned out of the war economy, and here we are today. So in a sense, it's almost like economics is a victim of its own success. It was highly regarded, so therefore government wanted to co-opt it, and then they got the people who always looked at things from a statist sort of perspective, and that's why we are where we are today, I guess.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if we want to make it in government, then of course what you want to do is provide politicians with whatever rationale they need for whatever they want to do anyway, right? Yep. And in a sense, you're pointing to a very important revolution in economics, because before Keynes's master work, there was not really a division or a separation between micro and macro. So if you look at someone like Mises, I mean the dean of the Austrian School, or whatever you want to call him, a very influential guy, world-renowned economist too. If you look at his works, they're mostly in macro, because he's talking about money, he's talking about the whole economy, those sort of things, right? But of course he did micro as well, so he's looking at businesses and entrepreneurship as well, because there was not really a difference, the same method, the same assumptions, because the economy is the economy. It doesn't matter if you're talking about big statistics, there's still going to be aggregates of micro actions. But after Keynes, I mean, the whole thing that he did in economics was make macroeconomics a separate science. So macroeconomics sort of created politically in order to provide politicians with a rationale for what they wanted to do anyway, because economists were holding back, saying that, well, you can't just print a whole lot of dollar bills because that's going to cause a lot of problems. Well, there was Keynes saying pretty much, well, if the situation is like this, then printing bills is a pretty good idea. And here are some random theories that I made up so that I can show that this is scientific, right? Yeah. And you have this problem today too, that when you study micro and macro, different methods, different models, you can't really combine them either, because whatever you learn in micro is contradicted by what you learn in macro, and vice versa.
Talk about that. I'm not necessarily, it's been 25 years since I took a college class in economics, and remember, again, that's like the first day they basically tell you macro and micro are different, and then you're right, I don't remember them ever really talking about how and whether they link and work together. So why do you say that the prevailing scholarship is incompatible, micro versus macro is incompatible? What are they doing there?
Well, they speak completely different languages, and I mean, if going back to the basics, or at least from the beginning, I mean, microeconomics is sort of an outgrowth of classical economics, and it part of it is what is sometimes referred to as Say's law, which is misunderstood as supply creates its own demand, which is not really what it means. That's a straw man. I mean, what it means is that production precedes consumption. So in a market situation, you have to produce something in order to, in return, get the purchasing power so that you can buy something. So that's part of it. The other part of it is, of course, that unless someone produces, there's nothing for you to buy with that purchasing power. It seems pretty obvious, right? Well, it can be argued that Keynes's magnum opus was written to get rid of this law. Because the problem with this, of course, is that politicians can't really create wealth if Say's law is still in effect. Because then what that means is that, well, you have to produce in order to consume, you have to produce value in order to extract value from the marketplace, which means the only way you can create growth is by having people produce more value somehow. Well, that's really hard, and that requires innovations, that requires lowering the barriers to entry and things like that, right? But politicians can't really do that because their whole business is to raise the barriers of entry and picking winners and things like that, right? So they're tampering with and distorting the marketplace. That's all politicians do, and all they can do, really, unless they get a sort of an honest job. And Keynes wanted to get rid of that because by getting rid of that law, you open up for a lot of policy solutions, quote unquote, in the economy. So much of macroeconomics is sort of based off of his theorizing instead of Say's law, in that sense, right? So that's why they're I wouldn't say they're moving in parallel, perhaps, but they're going in different directions, and both are now today sort of holding, seeing the market as inefficient. There are imperfections and inefficiencies that compared to a sort of it's a made up imaginary model of what would be an efficient market. The difference, though, is that for macroeconomists, they're talking about efficiency in terms of aggregates, and they're assuming that aggregates have constant relationships. So you have such things as the Phillips curve and things like that. So, well, if you it has to do with the relationship between the interest rate and inflation and the unemployment rate, and things like that. But those are, of course, if you look at it from an Austrian perspective or from a micro perspective, why would they have something to do with each other? They don't really. They can, of course, but that's different. And aggregates depend on the actions by individuals that make up those aggregates. And actions don't just follow blindly whatever the aggregate is doing. We have all sorts of ideas and new thinking and learning too that changes our behavior. So you can't really say that any aggregate has a constant relationship to any other aggregate. That doesn't make any sense,
Right?
especially if you include the measurement of it, and the measurement, of course, is government statistics. Then everybody can see that this is just ridiculous, right? But in order to granting legitimacy to policy, macroeconomics serves its purpose.
Yeah. So I want to ask about the difference between in your book, and I think in Bob Murphy's book and a lot of Austrians, it's kind of a core insight that there are economic laws that are true. We deduce them from just logic and how the mind works and what we know about reality. And so that I see that approach as being kind of different from physics in the sense of, you can do experiments in physics and test things. And okay, here's what we know of as the law or the theory of gravity. On one hand, the hard science approach, and then like the other social sciences, which is very sort of qualitative and describing after the fact and stuff. So how do you, I know that's one criticism that you hear of people that they have of Austrian economics is that they really hate the action axiom and the praxeological approach because they say it's not scientific. And so we have the Austrians saying, oh, it is scientific in the sense that it's logic based and we can deduce laws from this. And then the other side, just like they don't even they just like that's they just kind of laugh it off and move on. So why are we right on that? as opposed to why does that approach fit economics rather than the softer sociological approach or the harder physics kind of approach?
Right. And I mean, that's a very important question. Um, I usually put it the way that economics laws are more reliable and they're harder than laws of physics, which is usually something that, well, it's very provocative to say that. And that's
Right.
part of why I say it too. But the reason I say it is that exactly that what you pointed out, that in the natural sciences and also the other social sciences and well, modern mainstream economics too, they're all inductive. Right, so they're going through, sifting through data, and the more data, the more sure they are, at least hypothetically, right? And then you can find conclusions about the relationships between different types of data and in different situations and things like that. And in the natural sciences, what's different from the social sciences is that they can run experiments where you control for all kinds of variables, and you're sort of sure that you're measuring what you think you're measuring. But the thing is, they're all wrestling with the problem of induction. Just because the sun has risen every morning until now doesn't mean that it will tomorrow. So there's always this uncertainty to it, and you can always find a data set that contradicts what you thought were true. And you can always figure out that, whoops, we have been measuring this the wrong way. So there falls this whole hypothesis. And I mean, physics is a good example of this, because we talk of gravity and we can measure gravity and we have a sort of an estimate of what gravity is, but we don't know what the heck it is. Right? So there's really nothing to explain. What is it? Why is it that bodies of matter attract each other?
Right.
Well, we don't know. We have no clue. Right? In economics, however, or I would claim as an Austrian in all social sciences, you would start with simply that we act, human beings act, and it's a purposeful action. So what that means is that we think that we can become better off by doing certain things, and that means that we are not fully content with the situation or how we expect the situation will evolve, but we think that we can make it better somehow. Right? And we can make it better by using some type of means. So we already have an understanding for what the difference is between means and ends. Because means are what we want to attain, and means are what we use to attain them. And if we didn't need means to attain the ends, then why wouldn't we already be there? We would, right? So it's sort of it's in a sense that a definition, or at least a conceptualization that we can all understand, and we all know that we act personally. So it's no biggie, and we can observe it in everybody else and things like that. We can understand that people are trying to achieve something, whatever it might be, on their own terms, right?
Right.
Well, based off of this, we can derive all kinds of things that must be as true as action as purposeful behavior. So one thing that I often use is diminishing marginal utility, which means that if we have one of an item, then we're going to value it more highly than if we have a second one. And why is that true? Well, it has to be true because if we're always trying to attain something that we personally value, then if we have one means only, then we're going to use that to the highest possible end. As far as we understand, of course, there are plenty of limitations to our actions, but as far as we understand, we're going to use it to the highest possible value in our personal terms. If we get another one, we're going to use that to the second highest. If we get another one, we're going to use that to the third highest value that we can use these means for, as far as we ourselves understand. If we would lose one, we would lose the lowest value that we can attain with it. It doesn't matter which one we lose. So even if I would sort of take a piece of chalk or something, and I would mark them A, B, and C, and I would use A for the highest value, B for the second highest, and C for the third highest. If I would lose A, I wouldn't lose the highest value I can attain with these means. I would just rearrange them.
Right.
Right. So we know that the more you have of something, the lesser we would value all of them individually. And it has to be the case because it follows directly from what action means. And there's no exception to this. There can be no exception to this. And I know that sounds sort of dogmatic, but at the same time, it's dogmatic in the sense that math is dogmatic, that 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't equal 4 usually. It
Right.
equals 4 always. It doesn't equal anything else, right? And the same thing with geometry. That a square has 4 equal sides and 4 right angles. It doesn't have anything else. We don't have to measure this stuff. We don't have to go out there in the world and look at, let's see this square. Is it a square or what is it? And let's measure this square and see if it is actually a square. No, because it's true that a square is a square.
Yep.
Right.
It's go ahead.
No, so I was just going to say that economics in this sense, in the Austrian sense, is much more narrow, or the economic theory is much more narrow, because it provides the framework for how we understand things, like diminishing marginal utility. But it doesn't give us a way of measuring and predicting exactly what's going to happen, because people can make up whatever reason they like, and they can act in whatever way they feel like, and exactly how they value things. Well, we don't know.
Right.
We don't know how they value things. We don't know what they value or what they see and understand in any situation. So we do know that they act in a certain way, though. So if they value a certain thing, a widget, then if they have many widgets, they will value each widget less than if they had only one. We know that for sure.
Right. And that's one of the caricatures of free market economic thinking that, again, I encountered in college. And this was before I knew who Mises and Rothbard were. But I was kind of a Milton Friedman, Adam Smith, I was kind of grew up in the Reagan years. So I was kind of a standard conservative Republican in the mid 90s. And I remember talking with one of my professors, and they're like, "Oh, you free marketeers, you just look at people as economic beings and think they just want to make money and all this stuff." And I think I was stumbling onto kind of the response to that is that, no, not, looking at people from an economic perspective with a logical framework. It does allow for the fact that different people want different things. And I think that's something that confuses people about Austrian economics, is that on one hand, we say, okay, here are these laws of economics, which we're claiming are objectively deduced from logic, but yet value is subjective. And so like conservatives will hear that and think of like moral relativism or, anything goes and all this. And they don't see how those two concepts are really closely linked. And that, basically the fact that everybody has a different sort of spectrum of wants and desires, that's what sets the stage for how society operates. And so talk about that, just that on one hand, we're saying certain things are objective. And then I think that second insight that value is determined subjectively by each individual human, that there's something really deep in how those two things interact.
Yeah, there is. And it all is all tied together through the action axiom, right? That action is purposeful behavior, like we talked about, that because people value different things, excuse me, they will act differently as people, but the structure to how they act is not different, because we're all people and action is still action, right? So, and if economics were to assess and analyze what people actually value and why, we would easily get into discussing a valuation of what they value as well. But economics is not about that, right? The economics takes people as they are, and that's the starting point. So there are people, the people are living together, they're interacting and so forth. Okay, how can an economy satisfy as many people as possible using the limited resources we have? And how does that actually work? Because it does work, right? In some sense, we are getting better off all the time, and people are exchanging with each other and so forth. Well, on what basis, and what are the actual results of this? How do we explain the whole economy around us? That's what what economics is trying to do, or at least was traditionally. And we can explain these things if we recognize that people value things personally. That is subjective, right? So an obvious example that sort of it confuses people when they start thinking about it a little bit is a simple exchange. Why would you and I exchange things with each other? Well, The only reasonable reason that we would do that is because I value what you have more than what I have to give up to get it. And you value what I have, what you can get, more than what you're giving up to get it. It doesn't mean that, as you would probably assume from the curves when you take economics courses, that there's an indifference, that they're valued equally. Because if they're valued exactly the same, then why the heck would we go through the trouble of exchanging them? Well, we wouldn't. But since we value them differently and we choose voluntarily to exchange these things with each other, well, then we're both better off by going through the exchange. Which causes a reallocation of resources throughout, right? And then you can involve production and all these other things that makes it more complex. But it's based off of this fundamental sort of unit, if you will, in the market economy, the exchange for mutual gain.
I think sometimes people are confused because they're not trained in an economic way of thinking. They think that value is objective. So I when I was a teenager, I collected baseball cards, and there was a publication called Beckett Baseball Card Monthly, and they would basically publish, the going rates for all these different cards. And I was talking about my dad, who was an auto worker and a really smart guy. And I was like, oh, this card is worth this card is worth that. And he said, he wasn't being mean about it, but he's like, hey, something's only worth what someone will pay for it. And so I was laboring under the notion that, there's a number attached to an item, so therefore those things are equal. And like what I think that really opened up, I think maybe that's one thing that sort of made me a libertarian, and kind of from an Austrian, revealed in me kind of an Austrian outlook was, it's not, this price isn't somehow intrinsically tied to this object, as I found out, because like I would go to these baseball card shows and try to sell them. And sometimes like I would put the price on there that was in the book, but they wouldn't sell, or somebody would offer me less. And so I figured out all that I think once you figure out that what exchange is that both people sincerely believe they're benefiting at the time, that really breaks away a lot of, I think it gives you the ability to spot a lot of economic fallacies, like the minimum wage and all this stuff, is because people are always making claims, I think, from the notion that, this should be worth something, so therefore we should pass a law. So I think that insight of subjective value has really opened up my eyes to see a lot of what's actually going on.
Yeah, it's a fundamental concept. I mean, you can't really understand the economy or the world without it, because you don't know what actually incentivizes people to take certain actions.
Yeah.
So understanding that value is subjective, I mean, we all know this. I mean, I ask my students too, why is value subjective? Do you ever realize that it is subjective? Because we're so used to living in a world where there are objective prices in dollars for everything. So we think of value in terms of dollars, just because money can buy a lot of things. Yet at the same time, when we try to figure out what people value, well, we value things very differently.
Right.
And most people have the experience of thinking that someone else, whom we might know very well, likes something. We get them that something, and they're disappointed.
Yep.
Now, obviously, it's not objective, because then we could just say, well, if you want to make someone happy, you just buy them a more expensive gift, because the objective value is higher, right? But that people will not be happy if you buy certain things to them that they have no use for whatsoever, but it came at a high price. That's not the value, right? It's that is the market value in objective money terms. So, yeah. And that's different, because that is really everybody's subjective values for both money and the purchasing power of money, and that good, and how many of that good there are. So it's back to diminishing marginal utility, right? And then everybody's acting on it, and then we get a price formed in money, which is also the problem, right, with inflation and so forth. When you suddenly have a whole lot more money in circulation, well, then money loses its value, because there's so much more around. So money too, of course, has diminishing marginal utility. If there's more in the economy, it's going to be worth less.
Yeah. There are three big terms that come up in your book a lot, and I think they're all sort of very intricately linked, and that's entrepreneurship, economic calculation, and social cooperation. So I'll just throw those out, and I have like 12 questions about them, but I'm sure that you can kind of explain the relationships and probably answer all those questions by just examining the relationship between those three terms and how they work together.
Sure, and it's funny you mentioned that, because I didn't do it on purpose, but they are core to how Austrians understand the economy.
Yep.
At the very same time, they're not really part of other schools of economics at all. So they excluded the entrepreneur is the obvious one, right? That if you study economics, if you go through the undergrad and you get a master's and you get a PhD, odds are you will never hear the term entrepreneur or entrepreneurship.
Right.
And even if you do, then it usually just refers to small businesses. So it has nothing to do with innovation or creating new value or anything like that. That's simply not part of it, because that doesn't fit the models. But in the real economy, well, we all know that entrepreneurship is super important. And even politicians recognize that entrepreneurship is important, right? So all this new growth that we want, the higher standard of living, where does it come from? Well, it comes from entrepreneurship. And I usually say that what entrepreneurs do is that they create our future. They create our tomorrow. That's their line of business. If they create the best possible version of our future on our terms, then we buy their stuff and they earn a profit. But in order to do that, well, if there was unlimited resources, it would be easy, because then we could all just do entrepreneurship all day long and we wouldn't need to care about anything else. The problem is that we don't have a whole lot of resources. They're very, very, very limited. So we need to somehow figure out which entrepreneurship should we do and which lines of production are best for people in general compared to other lines of production. And that's a huge problem, not only in sort of the sense that socialists see it, that they try to, let's reallocate resources, because they think of it as a sort of a one-shot game and everything is in the present. The problem is that entrepreneurs are undermining each other's lines of production. They're undermining each other's claims to produce value by producing more value, pretty much. And they're all aiming at future consumers who might have learned something new or in different situations and so forth. So there's so much uncertainty involved. And then the question is, how can you allocate resources, anything from iron ore to freighter ships to everything like that? How can you allocate those things so that you get as much value as possible in the end? And socialists have no answer to this problem unless they get rid of uncertainty or they assume that everything happens at once. Because then it's easy. Then you can take sort of the equations and whatnot else and find a solution for it. The problem is that there's continuous change. So how do you do it? Well, I mean, the obvious answer, well, it's obvious now after Mises helped us with economic calculation, is that entrepreneurs compete with each other and they base their bids for resources based on the value that they think they're going to produce. And this is what I teach to entrepreneurship students too, that what they should focus on is not how valuable they think for themselves that what they're producing is. Because of course they're going to produce something that they think is good, but it doesn't mean that their customers will actually like those things, right? So they have to focus on how valuable might this be for a specific type of customer. And then based off of that, what price would the consumer be willing and able to pay for this? Well, I mean, the more value you offer at a lower price, the more easier it is to sell, and you will sell more probably, right? But then your task as an entrepreneur is to figure out how can you produce this thing so that you can still sell it at a price that is attractive for the customer and make something in between yourself. Well, I mean, the obvious answer is that, well, you have to pick those costs that are as low as possible, but you can, when you're competing with others, if you place too low bids for all resources, you're not going to get any at all, and then you can't produce. That's even worse. So what is the limit to how much you can pay for a certain resource? Well, it depends on its contribution to the final value. which is, of course, based off of your expectation and anticipation of how valuable your good is. Well, if this is the case, then all entrepreneurs are bidding consistently for resources based off of the value that they think they're going to produce. Then, depending on how much there is of something and how useful it is, the price is going to be based off of the future valuation. And since they're all bidding using money and not something else, we can easily compare different things, which means any single entrepreneur trying to create something new will say, okay, so this is really valuable. I think I can sell it for $100 each, and I can sell 100 of them, right? Then I have $10,000, of which I would like to keep some as profits, but I will not pay more than $10,000 for the resources. Then you can go out in the market and say, okay, so everybody else has bid for resources and thereby have contributed to forming prices for the resources. Then I can pick and choose what materials I'm going to use, and things like that, right? To try to make the product and figure out through calculation whether I will reasonably make a profit off it or not.
Yeah.
Right. So this causes a constant reevaluation in money terms of resources, and of course it gets the resources to the highest bidder, which means whoever is expecting to create the highest value will be able to get the most suitable resources because they can outbid everybody else. So the resources sort of automatically, as invisible hand is what Adam Smith used, right, to illustrate this. So the resources are automatically allocated towards the highest expected value for consumers. So that's the social coordination, right?
Yep. I think one of the important things to remember, and something I encounter again when talking to opponents or people who don't understand how the market works, is they say, well, businesses fail all the time. That they always bring up these imperfections in life that would result from the free market economy. And I think it's that's where your description of, hey, think of the economy as a process, and it's a process, but it's also and because it's a process, it's never going to be perfect. So I think that sometimes free market people kind of sell things as, freedom and liberty will fix all of society's problems. I know we don't actually say that, but I think sometimes people hear that. But I think it's crucial to point out to them that, no, we're not saying that like everybody will figure out everything all the time, and every economic transaction will result in everybody being so much happier and there will be no problems. It's just, we're saying that given the reality of logic and how humans act, this is a self-correcting system that enables things to progress and for people to cooperate in a nonviolent way that sort of improves over time. So it's not compared to we're not preaching perfection. We're saying, hey, this is the way the process works most efficiently, but there are still all kinds of inefficiencies and mistakes and disappointments and things like that, because that's how life is.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, since it is a process, there are all kinds of imperfections. And in the book chapter in the previous book that I wrote, I said markets are imperfect, but they're unbeatable. And they're unbeatable because of this decentralized decision making, and everybody's using their imagination, trying to figure out, how can I serve, as entrepreneurs, how can I serve consumers best? Or as employees, how can I get the most out of my workday? Well, you try to get the job that pays you most, or that gives you the best work conditions and things like that, right? Where you have the best, highest value contribution, and that's, since it is imperfect, you can re-choose if you didn't choose the right thing and whatnot else. But the issue is is that since it is a process and not a fixed system, we will discover new things, and everybody knows this. This is one of those sort of very frustrating things with economics, that there's so many things that people know, but that they just discount or simply overlook when they think about the economy, and economists do this too, right? They would say, "Oh, the market isn't perfect." Okay, but we all know that there are new innovations, and we even expect new innovations to happen. And everybody knows that, well, we can't even predict what innovations will happen. And some people will even refer to, say, in the 50s, everybody thought that, oh, by the year 2000 or whatever, we would have flying cars. Well, we don't, but we have other things that no one predicted. And we all know that there's this uncertainty and that we're getting better in the future and everything like that. We know this, yet at the same time we say, well, it's not efficient, so it's not good. It's not perfect, so it's not good. Well, what does a perfect market look like? And I think in basically throughout human history, you had these thinkers thinking that, well, I don't think we can get any better than this, so why don't we just stop everything and then just redistribute it so that everybody gets their fair share, or that is equal share, and then that's it. I mean, imagine if they had done this before the automobile, before we invented vaccines and all kinds of medicine, pretty much. We would be in a terrible shape forever. So of course we need to not stop things and not redistribute them, but instead make as much as we can out of the situation, and know that in the future will give us something better if we allow entrepreneurs to provide it to us.
Yeah. So what do you make of kind of the resurgence of sort of Marxism and Marxist economic thinking kind of seeming to make a comeback among younger people? Why do you think that is? Do any of the students who make it to your class, are they laboring under those mistaken notions? Or I just kind of want your perspective on kind of how economic debate is happening and in the real world, and is it getting better? Is it getting worse? I'll just leave it there. I might have a follow-up.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, even as a business school professor in teaching entrepreneurship, you would expect my students to sort of have a sense that profit is not a bad thing. But unfortunately, I have a lot of students who sort of have this feeling that profit is not good because I've exploited someone. So it's not Marxism in the formal sense, but it's Marxist in an informal sense, right? That they have this, you're ashamed of profits, and I mean the biggest area in entrepreneurship today is social entrepreneurship. It's basically starting a business to do good but not make a profit because that's bad. Which means you haven't understood the first thing about the economy, right? Now, where does it come from? I think part of it is simply that I think the schools fail to provide students with a lot of knowledge. I mean, I have to, when they finally get to me, then they're usually 18. They've gone through about 12 years of more or less brainwashing. And they have some facts, but they've also learned how to misbehave in the classroom and to not be curious and not be interested. That goes for a lot of them. So I think unfortunately, they're taught the wrong things. But then I think it's also, in a sense, it's a curse that we are so well off as we are, because a lot of people, they're simply not exposed to the market mechanisms. So one thing that I've learned is that entrepreneurs, they're typically Austrians. They're not Austrians
whether they know it or not. They are, right?
Exactly. They don't know any of the terminology. They don't know the theory, but they understand how it works because they've tried and they've failed, and they've failed so many times in so many different things that they've figured it out, but implicitly, right? So they know that the customer is king. They know that they can't set whatever price they like because they have to figure out the price that the customer will like. Right, so it's basically out of their hands. They have to put a lot of effort into figuring out what the price might be, or they will fail. So they know this stuff, and I think in a sense, back in the day, a lot of people were exposed to the economy in a different sense. So in agrarian society, well, you had a lot of exchange of goods and a gift economy too, but you would also take whatever surplus you have and sell it in the market. Well, you have a direct exposure to what that means. And the same thing that you probably did not produce your own plow, and you didn't breed your own cattle or your own horses and things like that. So you were exposed to saving and where that gets you and how to expand your farm and what happens if there's a good year or bad year and things like that. So you had this direct feedback from market mechanisms. So even though, I mean, they weren't high-tech entrepreneurs or anything like that, but they had a feeling for it. Today is different because today a lot of people, they're bureaucrats all their lives, which means that they will just try to decide things and they have no clue of how the economy works. Or a lot of people are working in the private sector in huge bureaucracies. What do you learn about the economy if your job is basically to keep a cubicle warm all day? Well, you don't really, because everything is about pleasing your boss and climbing the corporate ladder. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but in terms of being exposed to the market economy and how the economy works on the production side, you're simply not.
Yeah. Yeah, there's one of the biggest tropes I see from economic illiterates today, especially young ones, are, oh, landlords are bad. I have no choice but to pay rent, and they never lower rent, and things, they have no incentive to do this or that, and they literally, like, there's so many economic fallacies like bundled up in that statement that landlords are evil and they don't do anything. Just think of, like, I think of, I own a house, my wife and I, and like, I have a tree that needs to be trimmed and all that stuff. And like all these little costs are always coming up at you, whether you like them or not. And just imagine a landlord who owns 100 apartments, like, the fact that the apartment is there, it's practically a miracle. And not that, and most of the things that people, I think, ascribe to landlords are because of interventions in the market economy. Like, oh, you can't build this, you can't build that type of building, you can't build it here. It's really frustrating that our perspective, a lot of what we're trying to unravel these fallacies that people have so deeply ingrained. It's kind of exhausting that people will believe an economically illiterate tweet, but they won't read a book like yours that actually kind of explains how things work. So I hope this book will get to some people, and I think it will, if people just will pick it up, because it's great. It's short, but there's like so much in the way of ideas there. So yeah, again, I think I started off by saying that, but it's a really great achievement here, I think.
Thank you. I hope so. I mean, the whole point is to basically throw it at people and have them read it. I mean, if they have a little bit of time, like you mentioned, it's very short. I aim to have it no longer than half the length of economics in one lesson, and I think it's about there. It's not longer than that, and it should be easy to read. So most people should be able to get through it in an afternoon or something like that, if they have an afternoon, or just spend a couple of nights one week and go through the whole thing. And I hope that it would inspire some new thoughts and some new thinking about how the economy works. Because part of the reason why I even started thinking about writing something like this is that it's so frustrating. Like, but just like you mentioned, the economic illiteracy out there is so enormous, and people are not, well, they don't hesitate at all. There's no reluctance whatsoever to invent new arbitrary, just ad hoc explanations for all kinds of phenomena that really know everything about. And we've known this for 150 years. But still, people make up their own weird explanations that have no basis whatsoever. And had they just been a little bit economically literate, then they would be able to explain it perfectly, and they could just go about their days, and they could make more money and stop making all these mistakes.
Yeah. I always love seeing, you'll see a politician or some commentator on Twitter say something like, oh, the minimum wage should be at least $25. And I always love it, because I'm like, yeah, these are my people. That libertarians are always chiming in like, well, what about 45? What about 700? And it seems that the people who are originally making these statements have like zero curiosity on engaging with any of that. And I hate to sound like I don't know what I sound like, but like it really is like a very emotional like, oh, I just think the world should be this way, and therefore I'm going to say it and feel better, and people who don't agree with me are bad. And again, like the amount of unreality people are comfortable with in their process of thinking is kind of sad. But I think it goes to something you mentioned, is that 12 years of public school really does the trick, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they are government schools, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to learn whatever the government thinks that you should learn. And then that's highly problematic. I mean, there are plenty of good teachers who are deviating from the school plan and stuff like that too, teaching kids good things. But there are plenty who learn the wrong things. And of course, they're also not incentivized to learn good things.
Yeah.
Even the same thing for me in grad school, learning economics. That's mainstream economics. It's complete nonsense, a whole lot of it. So I mean, studying Austrian economics, I had to get my own education in Austrian economics on the side of grad school. Most people don't really have that passion, and I don't blame them, because time is treasure. It's precious to us.
Yeah, it's scarce, right? So links to your book will be up on the show notes page, decentralizedrevolution.com/92. And I'll give you a chance to tell people how they can engage with you. And I'll put those links on the show notes page too. But how can they find out more about you? Are you working on anything else interesting at the moment? Just so people can know where to look to find out more about what you're doing.
Well, I actually released a new book, but one that I edited on Austrian economics, that is sort of summarizing where Austrian economics research is at right now and what to expect from the future. So that's something to look at. I'm very active on Twitter, so that's where people find me.
Let's talk about the book. So the book we've been talking about is How to Think About the Economy, but you just mentioned another book. So what's it called?
Yeah. It's called a Modern Guide to Austrian Economics, but it's more like a scholarly volume. So it's also priced as a scholarly volume.
Okay.
So
yeah.
It's definitely not the $5 as the How to Think About the Economy. It's $185, which is quite a bit more.
Well, maybe see if you're. I do things like I suggest that my local library buy things. And I get them to buy things a lot. So I may just try that book to see if they'll actually pay that much for it. But so congratulations on having two books from completely different sort of markets coming out around the same time. That's great. One other thing I want to mention about How to Think About the Economy is the back end of it has, and it's grouped by sort of like topic of suggested reading. And so a lot of people, like I noticed on Ask an Austrian, I forget if it was your episode or some of the others, people often ask, well, what else should I read? So I'm telling you should read How to Think About the Economy by Per Bylund. And then you should read the books that he talks about in the back of the book there, according to the subject you're interested in. So I cut you off when you're about to say where you are on Twitter.
Right. So my Twitter handle is just my name. So it's at Per Bylund.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this so soon after you did our other podcast, Ask an Austrian. But we've got the Mises Caucus, of course, is completely separate from the Mises Institute. But there's so much information there. We really appreciate the fact that we have access to helping promote the work that people like you do. So I can't praise this book more highly, and I really do thank you for your time and just for the fact that you've done really great work here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And there you have it. I'd like to thank Per Bylund for his time and wisdom and for writing such a great book, How to Think About the Economy. You can find a link to that book and to more information about Per and his work over at the show notes page, decentralizedrevolution.com/92. Thanks to my co-producer, Simon Kalpin, and of course, thanks to Dave versus Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. And of course, thanks to everyone who subscribes to our email list and gives to Mises PAC over at takehumanaction.com. And if you haven't done so before or haven't done it in a while, share this podcast, rate it, review it, subscribe to it, whether on Facebook, YouTube, or elsewhere. But please do that for the Decentralized Revolution podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.